1975, Las Vegas. The casino smells like sweat and cigarette smoke. A man in his early 30s walks past velvet ropes with his company's last $5,000 inside his pocket. He's wearing a blazer that doesn't quite fit, his eyes scanning for a blackjack table. He doesn't belong here. He doesn't even like gambling. But tonight, he has no choice. This man's company is down to its last dollars. Investors won't return his calls, and his employees have no idea the planes their jobs depend on can't fly tomorrow unless he walks out of here with enough money to fuel them. His name is Frederick W. Smith, and in the next 30 minutes, he's going to bet everything to save FedEx, a shipping company the world hasn't heard of yet. Because if FedEx fails tonight, the idea of overnight delivery dies with it. Mississippi, 1944. A town so small you could drive through it without shifting gears. That's where Fred Smith is born. Into comfort, yes, but not into safety. His father is James Frederick Smith, a Southern tycoon who built one of the largest bus companies in America, Dixie Greyhound Lines. A man of scale, but when Fred was just 4 years old, his father died suddenly. No goodbye, no inheritance talk, just gone. His world became quiet, too quiet. Fred grows up surrounded by his aunts and uncles, a well-mannered Southern household where boys are meant to be strong, stoic, and preferably healthy. But Fred isn't. At age 7, he starts limping. Doctors say it's Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease, a rare condition that deteriorates the hip joint. It leaves him crippled for years. He can't run, can't play. He watches the world race ahead while he's stuck dragging a leg brace across the floor. This wasn't just physical pain, it was isolation. The kind that keeps you in your head, because you aren't outside playing with the other kids on the street. The Fred learned something in those quiet years: how to be alone, how to be observant, how to live in his own head. By the time he recovers at age 10, he's no longer fragile, he's hungry. In high school, he throws himself into football, and not because he enjoys it, but because it proves he's tough and not afraid to take a hit. It's the first time he finds mentors, coaches, uncles, older boys who don't pity him, but push him. Discipline becomes his armor, determination, his weapon. And then he finds something that changes his life: flight. By age 15, Fred is flying small aircraft, solo. He's not a dreamer, he's a technician. He learns avionics by hand, memorizes airport codes, understands the math behind lift and drag. This isn't a hobby, it's a system he can control. The childhood made him tough. Aviation gave him a way to take control. When Fred goes to Yale in the early 60s, he doesn't exactly fit in. He's got a Southern accent and more grease under the fingernails than any of the other classmates. But in the classroom, he shines. He studies economics, obsesses over logistics. And in 1965, while the other students write essays about GDP trends, Fred wrote a term paper that some would call science fiction. He proposes a nationwide overnight delivery system using a hub of private aircrafts to bypass the patchwork of inefficiencies of commercial airlines and government mail. No one had ever seen anything like it. His professor gave him a C, and not because it wasn't written well, but because it simply was impossible. Too ambitious, too complicated, and too expensive. Fred didn't argue, he just filed the paper away. But 2 years later, Fred Smith will be back from Vietnam with a pilot's license, a few $1 million inherited, and something most men don't have: a strength and a will to prove they were right all along. What the professor doesn't know is that this paper isn't just theory, it's a manifesto. And Fred Smith has already decided he's going to make it a reality. By the time Fred Smith returned from Vietnam, He wasn't the same person who had written a term paper at Yale. He had flown missions in combat zones, coordinated helicopter supply chains, and learned firsthand what happens when logistics fall apart. War, more than business school, had taught him how fragile systems really are, and how much power there is in moving the right thing to the right place at the right time. The paper he wrote in college, the one his professor gave a C, wasn't just theory anymore. It had become something else entirely. It was a blueprint he kept replaying in his mind over and over. In 1970, just a few years after coming home, Fred made his first move. He purchased a small aircraft maintenance company in Arkansas. On paper, it was just a stepping stone into the aviation industry. In reality, it was the start of something much bigger. The following year, at age 27, he founded Federal Express, a company built around a single idea: that time was a resource businesses could no longer afford to waste. The vision was radical. Instead of relying on commercial airlines or the post office, FedEx would run its own fleet of aircraft, picking up packages in cities across the country, flying them all to one central location, sorting them overnight, and then sending them back out for delivery before the morning. No one had ever done anything like it. Fred chose Memphis, Tennessee, as the heart of the overnight package delivering system. Memphis had the right centralized location, runway length, and consistent weather. From there, he could reach the majority of the continental United States overnight. The concept was simple. The execution was anything but. To get FedEx off the ground, Fred used $4 million of his own inheritance and raised over $90 million in venture capital, one of the largest private funding rounds in American business history at the time. He wasn't building a business model, he was building an industry from scratch. On April 17, 1973, Federal Express officially launched operations. That night, 14 small Dassault Falcon jets carried 186 packages to 25 cities. It seemed to have initially worked. Not flawlessly or profitably, but it worked nonetheless. And for a brief moment, Fred thought the hardest part was behind him. Little did he know, he was seriously wrong. The battle for dominance had just begun, and this battle was filled with death, betrayal, and a trillion-dollar company trying to snuff him out at every turn. For the next 2 years, the company was barely surviving. Clients didn't adopt the service as fast as expected, and the volume was too low to cover costs. To add to it, fuel prices spiked due to the 1973 oil crisis, and as planes flew, the money evaporated. In its first 26 months, FedEx lost around $29 million. The cash reserves started to dry up and the credit lines began to close. Until finally the company had just $5,000 left in the bank. The demise of FedEx was imminent. Investors stopped returning calls long ago, and many board members wanted to shut everything down before more money was wasted. Fred didn't. Instead, he booked a flight to Las Vegas. It sounds like folklore, but it happened. With no other hope, Fred took FedEx's last $5,000 and walked into a casino. Not to blow off steam, not for a weekend getaway. He sat down at a blackjack table with one goal: to win enough money to keep the company alive for just a few more days. Somehow, he did. He turned $5,000 into $27,000 and transferred it back into FedEx's account to pay for fuel and operations. It wasn't a rescue, it was the lifeline, just long enough to buy more time. That night in Las Vegas stuck with Fred, not only because of the money, but because of what it revealed. He realized he was willing to do whatever it took to keep the company alive. After that, there were no more questions, no hesitation. He knew exactly how far he'd go. And for anyone watching, It might have seemed like that was the peak, the dramatic turning point where everything changed, but it wasn't. Because the hardest part of Fred's story wasn't losing money. It was what happened when things finally started to work, and everything around him began to fall apart. In 1975, FedEx was still weeks away from failure at any given moment. It had survived its launch. It had survived fuel prices, investor doubt, and near bankruptcy. But no amount of blackjack wins or borrowed time could change one fact: the company wasn't out of danger. And neither was Fred Smith. That year, his half-sisters filed a lawsuit accusing him of forgery. They claimed he had falsified documents to obtain a $2 million loan and had misused the family trust, selling stock at a major loss just to keep FedEx from collapsing. What had started as a desperate move now looked to some like fraud. A federal grand jury agreed. Fred was indicted in January. The charges were serious. If convicted, he faced prison time. And then, just hours after the indictment, something even worse happened. Fred was driving through Memphis when he struck a 54-year-old man named George Sturgill crossing the road. Fred didn't stop. Sturgill died at the scene. Fred was later arrested and charged with leaving the scene of a fatal accident, as well as driving with an expired license. Two life-altering events, one legal, one fatal, both in the same 24 hours. And it wasn't the first time. Back in college, Fred had been in another crash. One of his passengers died. No charges were filed then, but now it wasn't just a fluke. It seemed to be a pattern. The hit-and-run case was eventually dropped. The forgery charge? He was found not guilty. But what couldn't be undone was the fallout inside of FedEx. The board of directors had already been nervous. The company was barely scraping by. Now its founders was under investigation and involved in a fatal crash. They made a decision. Fred would be removed as CEO. He wasn't fired in the dramatic sense with big news headlines or a press conference. He was simply pushed aside, quiet and tactically. They thought the company needed a steadier hand. Unfortunately, they were wrong. Even in chaos, Fred understood one thing better than anyone else: how the system actually worked. He knew the aircraft, he knew the routes, he knew what would break and when. Even more importantly, he was the only person who wholeheartedly still believed in FedEx. So he waited. And when the smoke started to clear, the company began to stabilize. The investors began coming back, and once the threat of collapse faded, the board brought him back in desperation. Fred didn't talk about that period much. When he did, he'd say only that he refused to let FedEx die, and that if he had to beg, lie, or gamble to keep it alive, he would. This wasn't the heroic part of the story. It was the ugly part, the part most companies bury. But it mattered, because it showed just how far Fred would go, and what the cost of survival really looked like. By 1976, FedEx had finally turned its first profit. The system was working, and Fred was back in control. But the truth is, the man was never the same. Or was he? The man who once went toe-to-toe with governments, global competitors, and billion-dollar clients was back at it. But this time, he passed the point of no return. Because next, we'll see how FedEx took on the giants like UPS, DHL, and the US government itself, and how one decision from Fred Smith would cost the company nearly $900 million overnight. By the late 1970s, FedEx had survived what should have killed it. The business was profitable, planes were flying, and packages were arriving overnight, just like Fred Smith had imagined when he wrote that term paper back at Yale. But survival wasn't the goal. It was just the starting line. Fred had built a machine that could move anything, anywhere in the country. Now he wanted to scale it beyond borders. That meant challenging any systems, monopolies, or competitors, some which were backed by governments and backed by legacy and loyalty. The first institution he challenged was the United States Postal Service. For decades, USPS had a legal monopoly on letter delivery. No private company was allowed to enter that space. But Fred couldn't just sit on the sidelines. He jumped in and he launched FedEx Overnight Letter, offering a speed that the US government couldn't match. It was a calculated risk, and one he knew would trigger backlash, and it did. By the time USPS responded with its own express mail service, FedEx had already captured a decent portion of the market and solidified itself as a major player. While FedEx continued dominating the skies, it was still at a disadvantage on the ground. UPS had built a network of trucks, hubs, and warehouses that stretched to every corner of the country. Fred understood that FedEx would always be limited unless it could deliver directly to customers' doors. In 1997, FedEx acquired RPS, a growing ground shipping company that gave it the infrastructure to compete with UPS directly. It was a smart play on its own, but Lady Luck also intervened. That same year, UPS workers went on strike. For 2 weeks, the country's largest package carrier shut down, and FedEx was the only alternative for millions of deliveries. In a matter of days, it gained roughly 2% of the national shipping market, which amassed billions in revenue. That kind of growth usually takes years. Fred did it in 14 days. And after the domestic battle started to settle, his focus turned global. FedEx began expanding into Europe and Asia, where it faced new kinds of threats. In many countries, the postal systems were state-run, and foreign companies were either backed by regulation or locked out by protectionist policies. FedEx couldn't muscle its way in, so it had to quietly find another way. In France, it acquired numerous local carriers already licensed to operate. In China, it partnered through joint ventures that allowed it to work with the already established system. Every region required a different strategy. Sometimes it took years just to get approval to operate, but over time, the network continued to grow. By the end of the 1990s, FedEx was operating in more than 200 countries and territories worldwide. It wasn't fast, and it sure wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The most unpredictable competitor didn't come from Europe or from a national postal agency. It came from within, by one of FedEx's biggest clients, Amazon. For years, Amazon used FedEx to move its prime shipments across the country. But behind the scenes, Amazon was secretly building its own delivery system, one modeled on FedEx's network of trucks, hubs, and air cargo routes. But the end goal was to cut FedEx out. When Fred found out, he immediately took action. In 2019, FedEx ended its billion-dollar shipping contract with Amazon with one single email sent out on a Friday night. FedEx gave up a billion-dollar contract without a second thought. It was a bold move, and some called it reckless. But Fred believed that continuing to serve Amazon meant feeding a future rival. He had no intention of becoming a silent subcontractor inside someone else's empire. Fred had already taken on the US government. He had already outmaneuvered UPS, and he already built a global delivery empire. He had nothing left to prove. The Amazon split was different. It showed that even after 5 decades, he was still the cunning businessman from Yale, the dreamer who was still willing to do what it takes, even if that meant walking away from a fortune to protect the long-term independence and legacy he built. After continued success, Fred Smith stepped down as CEO of FedEx in 2022. He left behind a $55 billion behemoth and a legacy defined not by safety, but by risk. Risk that all stared in the face of doubters, like his college professor. FedEx had become a global force to be reckoned with. It was a simple idea made real by a founder who refused to quit, even when quitting made the most sense and no one else believed. What Fred Smith proved over and over again was that systems fail, experts get it wrong, And rules can be broken, but a good idea, backed by unrelenting obsession and execution, can still become a reality. If you're an entrepreneur in the making, or just someone who wants a unique, untold entrepreneurial story, subscribe to our channel. We will release new stories every Thursday and would love to hear your comments and feedback.